All right. Well, I think without further ado, we'll try and get started. I want to thank everyone for joining today. My name is Alice Worling. I'm an assistant professor here in the School of Epi and Public Health at the University of Ottawa. Before we begin, I want to state our Indigenous affirmation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So first, I just want to have a quick introduction to the Global Health Learning Network, for which this seminar is taking place today. This is a platform for knowledge growth and exchange within the community to really build a community of practice in global health that includes researchers, practitioners, public health practitioners, learners, and all from the global health domain. Part of the Learning Network includes this seminar series, and it's a collaboration between the School of Epi and Public Health, the Bruyere Research Institute, the WHO Collaborating Center for Knowledge Translation and Health Technology Assessment and Health Equity, and the International Global Health Office. So without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Vidya Krishnan today. She's a writer and journalist who reports on social justice and public health. Over the course of the last 20 years, she's spoken powerfully and poetically to power on several important stories, including the Rohingya genocide, rising racism and science denialism in South Asia, and more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the reasons I came to be familiar with her work was through her nonfiction debut, Phantom Plague, where she brings her literary talents to spotlight the global TB policy. And you can read more of her work in The Atlantic and Caravan magazine. If I can just add a quick plug, given that tomorrow is World TB Day, it's really an excellent read if you're interested to read on this topic. She has done a really fascinating commentary in the Phantom Plague around TB policy and how that's affecting our societies. So I can certainly personally endorse that. So without further ado, Vidya, I want to pass the mic over to you and welcome you to our Global Health Learning Seminar. There will be a question period at the end. So if you're interested, you can certainly put your questions in the chat and we'll try and get to that. Or at the end, please raise your hand and we'll get a chance to have an interesting discussion following the presentation. So Vidya, without further ado, let me pass it over to you, and looking forward to your talk. Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, I just realized. Thank you for having me. It is such a pleasure to be here. I see in the comments someone saying that they read the book in 2 days. Thank you so much. I'm glad you found it engaging, and I hope we can have a more involved conversation at the end of it. I don't want to have enough time at the end for the Q&A, so I'm going to dive right in. I do have a lot of things to say and very little time to say it in. Here goes. My audience today is of a scientific bent of mind, and I'm going to be talking about unscientific things for the next hour, like love and grief and other complicated emotions that populate our inner lives. Writers are sentimental creatures after all. And though it might appear otherwise, my writing is not about science or history or literature. It's about power. It's about the pettiness of power and the myopia of powerful people. This lecture is about unconstrained power of well-intentioned people who make decisions that result in excesses such as the ones I will recount here. My lecture today is called The Cruelty of Charity. Contemporary philanthropy, the industrial complex that is organized charity, was born out of desperate human misery, intensified by great wars and then by industrial revolution. Before that, there was old-fashioned charity linked to religion. I'd argue even back then, charity was cruel, devoid of sentimentalism, not so much as aiming to provide salve to the wretched for their sake, but to do some sort of social sanitation so that the poverty and the filth and the misery brought on by an unequal world could remain contained. Primarily, charity has always been a program of self-protection. It has always been about the person performing the act of charity. It has some disingenuous emotional mathematics woven into it. This small-scale, straightforward charity of the 21st century was nothing like what we are witnessing today. Today's organized philanthropy, unlike today's organized philanthropy, straightforward charity lacked the steely, detached, technocratic resolve that is baked into this industrial complex. Organized philanthropy of the 21st century takes this disingenuous emotional mathematics to a new scale, and we'll talk about it more later. America's first general purpose philanthropic foundations like Russell Sage, Carnegie, Rockefeller, all paved the way for today's big philanthropy. And big philanthropy has always pushed for private interests. The earliest example of this was what we now know as the Ludlow Massacre. On April 20th, 1914, approximately 21 people, including women and children, were killed when private guards employed by Colorado Fuel and Iron Company attacked the residence of 1,200 striking coal miners in Ludlow, Colorado. The miners were demanding better working conditions. J.D. Rockefeller, part owner of this coal company, was later widely blamed for having orchestrated the Ludlow Massacre. This is a kind of example of the philanthropic harm that has been inflicted through history. While outright violence is rare, philanthropic harm can range from deliberate misappropriation of funds to hoarding of resources or to quid pro quo arrangements, all of which we witnessed during the pandemic. In my reporting for both COVID and TB, I've documented these harms of commission and will not waste your time with that here. Today, I want to talk about the harms of omission, which is a more profound injury caused by organized philanthropy. As of March 2023, 6.8 million people have died because of COVID-19. This is slightly an underestimate given the underreporting of fatalities in many countries such as Russia, China, and India. Every country has faced its share of horrors from the coronavirus pandemic, but in India, my home country, people died like the wretches of 14th century Sicily, facing wave after wave of Black Death, bodies floating in our mythical rivers and rotting by the roadside of our modern cities. No amount of hyperbole or biblical allusions will capture the horror of watching people for weeks on end weep over the bodies of their loved ones and steel themselves to endure more. Through this period, the industrial complex of organized philanthropy has done its work without any crisis of conscience. But before we get to the work, I want to take you back 3 years in time. It's March 2020, 3 months since Wuhan, China, and coronavirus have become household words. The world has never felt so fragile, and the plague is inching closer, as plagues always do. Infectious diseases, more than any other diseases, have wider social and behavioral causes. By the second wave, that is 2021, we carved out the kind of pandemic we were going to have, that is socially constructed a plague in which the mutated coronavirus behaved like a toddler in the middle of a tantrum with nothing or no one to control it. The Bosch pandemic response and the massive death toll it led to were not the handiwork of politicians alone, but also philanthropists. Elsewhere in the world, politicians, scientists, and whole governments have had to bear the consequences of mishandling the pandemic. In Brazil, over 80 prominent figures, including former President Bolsonaro, was charged with inciting a pandemic, accused of delays in purchasing vaccines, accused of government negligence and marketing unscientific treatments. French police raided homes of senior government officials, including former Health Minister Olivier Véran, as part of an investigation into the handling of the coronavirus pandemic. In Malaysia, 2 successive coalition governments fell in a span of 18 months. In the United States, many political analysts argue that Donald Trump lost his bid for re-election partly due to his many blunders in handling COVID-19. What a philanthropist, though. What does 6.8 million deaths from a vaccine-preventable disease, no less, say about the collective leadership of global philanthropy? A leadership that is largely unaccountable and has played a significant role in carving out the pandemic we were all going to have. These are critical questions we face in the aftermath of the chaos and trauma of the plague. These are also questions public health has been wrestling for years and must now address more forcefully. Because pandemics are not simply biopolitics, the politics of life. They are also necropolitics, the politics of who is disposable and who is not. During the viral apocalypse visited on India, the plague burst forth in all its malignancy and swallowed 2.7 million Indians. News reports and social media posts from the darkest days of the second wave are awash with macabre accounts of desperate people screaming out for scarce oxygen, hospital beds, ventilators, and ambulance, and then screaming out for scarce coffins and wood for funeral pyres. From April through July of 2021, India lay prostrate at the mercy of the plague. There was nothing to do but wait it out and attend to our dead. The 2.7 million Indians who died in 4 short months were disposable to the global health order. Those of us left standing after the second wave are left with a single question. What does it say about the global health order that India, a country with immense resources, a reputation for the best doctors in the world, unmatched experience in dealing with infectious diseases, deep logistical knowledge in organizing mass vaccination campaigns, the world's largest generic pharma industry, and also the biggest laboratory of big philanthropy, the Gates Foundation, descended into a viral apocalypse despite being the global manufacturing hub of COVID-19 vaccines. In these plague years, I find myself wondering about the relationships between our billionaire philanthropists and us, the citizens of the post-colonial world, upon whom these billionaires perform their missionary acts of charity, how they teach us to wash our hands and sneeze into our elbows and never ever aspire for anything more than enduring. They teach us, most importantly, to never question the actions of the most powerful and amongst the least diverse actors in global health and big philanthropy, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Conceptually, and in fact, the global health order interacts in a specific manner with specific biases with the post-colonial world. In India's case, as people died by millions, Indian factories had been pumping out millions of vaccine doses since January of that year and distributing them to 95 countries. In May 2021, around the time Delta wave peaked, only 4% of India's 1.3 billion people had been vaccinated. In the United States, the number was upwards of 40% during the same period. When India stopped exporting vaccines to meet its own demands, African nations were left to fight the plague with a prayer. Errors were piled on errors, and more errors were piled on them. It's urgent to look at philanthropy's neck-deep involvement in the horrors of the pandemic. I'm not here to talk about the failures of philanthropy. I'd like to talk about its biggest success instead, the global vaccine distribution project called COVAX. The kindest explanation for COVAX is that it was a fevered hippie dream of global solidarity, with the rich having an opt-out option. It was led by Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance. The second actor was CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations. And the most crucial and under-empowered player was the WHO. It could pass off as a vision of genuine global solidarity. That is the kind you come up with if you live inside a John Lennon song. The more I think about it, the more I am certain that philanthrocapitalists seem to operate from this hippie paradise where everyone is interested in everyone else's well-being, and we are a global village, and all of us live by the John Lennon framework of international cooperation. All we need is love and deep pockets, of course. Operating from this hippie paradise, the men behind COVAX, and it was mostly men, generously assumed good behavior from rich governments and giant multinational corporations who had no track record of good behavior. With pockets deeper than the deepest oceans, the genius billionaire do-gooder crowd could not predict what every poor nation could: vaccine hoarding, profiteering, a general unwillingness to share fruits of modern medicine that is unique to the West. Crisis after crisis, we make the same errors we made during the HIV epidemic of the 90s, when Africa remained on the sidelines despite being the hottest of hotspots. When the pandemic hit, I was writing my book, Phantom Plague, an autopsy of the global TV program, recounting how Indian patients, despite living in the hottest of hotspots, have no access to the latest TB therapies. The same mistakes were reliably made during the coronavirus pandemic, especially with COVAX. The COVAX facility is a direct byproduct of the Gates Foundation positioning itself at the center of the global effort to deliver COVID vaccines to poor nations. An autopsy of the pandemic response that doesn't answer why the burden to vaccinate the world was on India and not on wealthy nations that had inoculated more of its people at the time is useless. COVAX was launched in April 2020 with one primary supplier, India, which under democratic and predictable governments has been the pharmacy of the world. It is no longer democratic or a reliable partner to the WHO. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government has contested WHO's excess mortality claims, which put the number of dead Indians at 4.7 million, nearly 10 times the number Modi government has been willing to admit. With COVAX, we were asked to believe that a government that cannot address its own internal public health issues like rampant drug stockouts in India's HIV and TB program, the rapidly rising antimicrobial resistance, as well as stunting and malnourishment in children under 5 in India, will competently somehow handle the responsibility to vaccinate 92 other nations in the middle of a raging pandemic. COVAX is the story of how the global pandemic response was a Bosch long-distance race long before the opening shot was fired. At the start of 2021, Gavi and CEPI, the Vaccine Alliance and the Coalition for Pandemic Preparedness, allotted 2 billion doses to poor countries, wildly insufficient to cover the population of 92 countries. These miserly targets of COVAX were to be met by one company in India, the Serum Institute. By September, it was clear that COVAX would not meet its target, and it slashed its already low-ball target by another 30% to a little over a billion doses. By November, COVAX had shipped only 435 million doses, failing to meet the miserable target it had arrived at after it had failed to meet the original miserable target. Then came the double dipping, which is rich countries buying directly from pharmaceutical companies as well as dipping into COVAX. And then came the hoarding, all of which I'm certain blindsided the well-intentioned billionaire crowd that came up with this idea. I will admit that 2 decades of reporting public health did not prepare me for the greed and lovelessness that I witnessed in the past 3. The few doses that did arrive from COVAX were so close to expiry that they could not be used. In Malawi and East Timor, vaccines had to be destroyed, whereas in South Sudan and Congo, doses were returned. In the United States, the nation of wanton waste, 82 million doses were wanted and wasted between December 2020 and May 2021. This was just over 11% of the government's supply. Walgreens and CVS led this absurd squandering of resources. There was so much wastage that WHO had to come up with a vaccine wastage rate calculator, which was, of course, unused. In fact, 75% of COVID vaccines were administered in 10 countries in 2021. How and how much every nation wasted is not the point. The fact that they were in a position to do so is the real issue. There's been a lot of commentary about how rich nations have misused their power. The truth is, rich nations did not misuse their power. They simply used it. That is the whole point of power. All of it defied the twisted logic of free market solutions for healthcare, as the same countries were binning vaccines and hoarding them without extending the courtesy of affordable healthcare to Black and brown communities within the global north as well. One study revealed that COVID-19 death rate for African American patients would be 10% lower if they had access to the same hospitals as white patients. In Canada, another study found that Indigenous people were significantly more likely to be infected, more likely to experience severe COVID illness, and more likely to die from that illness. That the global health order allows for such a thing is a scandal. In the early days of the pandemic, there was a rich discourse about the people's vaccine, which seemed to make sense given that all the vaccine candidates were taxpayer funded. We forget that one of the early vaccine candidates came not from a pharmaceutical company, but from a university, the University of Oxford in UK. In April 2020, Adrian Hill, director of Oxford's Jenner Institute, generously funded by Gates Foundation, told the New York Times that he did not believe that at a time of pandemic, there should be exclusive licenses. The Gates Foundation felt differently. They had pumped in around $400 million in vaccine research at the Jenner Institute and had considerable leverage. They encouraged the university to partner with AstraZeneca, a multinational pharmaceutical company, which would then license Serum Institute in India, also a long-standing partner of Gates Foundation, to manufacture for COVAX. All the deals stayed within the Gates ecosystem. The resulting partnership with AstraZeneca had another effect. It changed Oxford University's distribution model from an open license platform designed to make its vaccine freely available to the manufacturer to an exclusive license controlled by AstraZeneca. Based on freedom of information requests from the Oxford University, we now know that 97% of this funding for this vaccine candidate came from taxpayers. In the end, COVAX funneled billions into pharmaceutical companies without requiring them to hand over intellectual property, and contracts signed between them remain opaque. Richard Wilder, CEPI's general legal counsel, who incidentally was formerly the general legal counsel for intellectual property at Microsoft, said that the transfer of intellectual property was neither effective nor necessary. None of this is a surprise. Bill Gates has been a ruthless monopolist his entire career, and global health, his favorite hobby horse, is a system he has created in his image, myopic, technocratic, and steely in its determination to not be swayed by sentiments even during a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. From the moment an exclusive license was arrived at, the die was cast that 2.7 million Indians would die, and that another 92 countries in Asia and Africa will be left to fight the plague with a prayer. Accessing vaccine became like getting a golden ticket at the Willy Wonka factory. In fact, the odds seem better at the factory. At least Charlie got a lifetime access to chocolate. But I stray from my theme. It's philanthropy and not fantasy fiction. The thing about styling yourself as a savior is that people expect you to do some saving in the time of a crisis. In India, during the second wave, watching people die was like watching someone starve at a feast. At Serum Institute, employees rolled up their sleeves and plunged into work that was hugely disproportionate in nature, supplying to the world's most populous country as well as 92 other nations. It's difficult to not think about the direction of the pandemic had the Oxford University vaccine, funded by public, remained a public good. We need to marinate in that for a bit. I believe we would have had a pandemic with no space for this orgy of international charity that we witnessed in the past 3 years. Every wealthy nation went on a bullying crusade to help the poor, with no regard to the actual needs of the poor. In Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau's government ordered 5 times the vaccine doses it needed. When asked to explain the decision, he said it was for donations to Africa and Asian nations, who, as a matter of fact, wanted to purchase those vaccines fair and square. The hoarding stripped the poorer nations of dignity. If this is not cruelty, I do not know what is. This is also a textbook example of how the Gates Foundation makes the world worse off by creating structures where the wealthy and the rich retain the power to snatch and bequeath vaccines like a school bully distributes his loot. The foundation has been criticized for teaming up with Big Pharma during the pandemic, but that's a crime of commission. What we omit is that by throwing its weight behind the industry, the foundation laid siege to global health. In the process, WHO has been hollowed out. The Gates Foundation, not coincidentally, is the second largest funder of WHO. It's also the largest funder of Gavi and CEPI. All that is to say that Gates Foundation is the corporation that runs global health. They donate to Oxford, they invest in pharmaceutical companies, they fund journalists and scholars and NGOs, they fund think tanks and policymakers. They fund every major health structure in visible and invisible ways. They are over and underground, and in both places, they are a motor that churns inequity. In 2021, as part of an investigation into the Gates Foundation, American news magazine, The Nation, examined 30,000 charitable grants the foundation had awarded over the past 2 decades. It found that over 88% of the donations, $63 billion, went to recipients in the wealthiest, whitest nations, including United States, Canada, Australia, and European nations. None of this is new. Way back in 2009, a study in The Lancet highlighted the same problem in Gates Foundation's work in public health, in global health. It funds the rich to help the poor. Once again, my interest is in the harm of omission, in the gravitational pull of these oligopolistic industries like big philanthropy and big pharma, which have a far-reaching impact on post-colonial nations. They disempower communities around the world. It's not simply undemocratic, they are anti-democratic. The idea of concentrating vaccines to a single manufacturer in the middle of a raging pandemic is like concentrating water supply to a single well when a city is burning down. It is immeasurably cruel. I refuse to believe that a decision can come from a place of love for humanity. This kind of heart can only originate from a place of fear, of losing control during the chaotic events of a plague, of a world order shifting to a place where it might not be in need of a savior. The targets that COVAX set to itself, even by back of the envelope calculations of someone as bad at math as I am, reveal that they are neither enough nor reasonable, given the amount of power that was consolidated to make it happen. The harm of omission in COVAX is that it suffered from a severe lack of aspiration. The kind of targets that are lovelessly arrived at when you neither belong to the communities you seek to shelter, nor will you face political consequences for mistakes that will be made. COVAX's low aspirations are not a byproduct of the circumstance. It's the most subtle and it's the most subtle and an insidious form of sabotage philanthropy inflicts on global health. It's amongst the cruelest cuts because it denies us the opportunity to be great, equal, and dignified in crisis. To watch India, which had vaccinated only 4% of its people, be responsible for vaccination programs in 92 other nations, was like watching a famished family asked to undergo austerity measures while a bloated and condescending West, with its ample resources and triple vaccinated citizens, passed diktats from Seattle and Geneva on how we should handle the crisis it had created. In its bone marrow, COVAX has the same flaw that plagues the rest of global health. It's based on a vision of the West with the role of savior for itself. We, the people of the global South, are reduced to a strange half-life, necessary as data, but expendable as human beings. This is the very essence of necropolitics. Big pharma and big philanthropy are unequal in power and unmerciful in self-preservation. They have fused together in the form of COVAX. The victims of organized charity are numbered in millions. Nothing can redress the grief visited on these unfortunate communities, which makes it urgent that these incredible events of the first 3 years of the pandemic be revisited and the role of charity in global health brought under tight scrutiny. Too much of what organized philanthropy does is a sideshow to the most pressing issue of our time, our right to health, funded entirely by taxpayers, a right conferred by the state and not outsourced to a third party and turned into a heavily NGOized commodity. When the next pandemic washes us ashore, a global vaccine distribution project cannot be the solution. The only solution is to decenter power for each continent to manufacture and supply its own needs, so Prime Minister Trudeau doesn't feel the need to save the rest of us. Through this pandemic, Gates Foundation, much like America's first general purpose philanthropic foundations of the 20th century, has pushed private agenda. Rockefeller hired strike breakers to orchestrate the Ludlow massacre. Bill Gates is subtler. He's orchestrated a hostile takeover of the world's superstructures and spawned the cottage industries of donor-funded campaign and compassionate access programs and flexi funds that exist to drown out words like justice, equality, and dignity. The current global health order is a million little NGOs funding mini revolutions that start at a $50 donation to whichever charity you support. This can no longer continue. The order may be holding on at the center, but all along the edges, it's coming apart. This malady conveys the objective need for a health structure that at long last concerns the whole world and not just the global north. Very little has changed over the past 100 years in the basic structure of big philanthropy. A structure that does so much to shield large-scale philanthropy from consequences of its own actions, including monumental errors like COVAX. They don't answer to customers or shareholders as corporations do, and they don't answer voters as politicians do. Looked at impartially, the generosity of billionaires is more dangerous, more blighting than the straightforward corruption of politicians and the greed of pharmaceutical multinationals, who at least have the decency to save us the savior complex. The threshold question here is not whether organized philanthropies are effective in solving the great problems of our times. For me, the threshold question is whether philanthropic capitalists are worthy of being trusted with so much power. At least 6.8 million people perished in the last 3 years on their watch as well. India, one of Gates Foundation's largest laboratories, was hardest hit by COVID. Uttar Pradesh, our largest state, as well as one in which Gates Foundation funnels millions of philanthropic dollars, was the hottest of hotspots, with bodies floating in the Ganga, our sacred river. Hindus believe that Ganga was brought on earth to bestow the faithful with nirvana, eternal salvation. Ganga is also believed to be the only river that flows through the 3 worlds, heaven, earth, and hell. During the second wave, as crematoriums ran out of space, Hindu families, mostly poor, left the dead to the mercy of the river, hoping that they would find peace in the afterlife. But there's no peace to be had for the living, because plagues don't simply mean lockdowns and quarantines and vaccines. The same way as the effects of philanthropy are not contained within global health alone. Unfortunately, it also means a desperate descent into chaos of all kinds of despair and disillusionment, science denialism. It makes the world more fertile breeding ground for all sorts of terrible things like nationalism, bigotry, xenophobia. All of this march arm in arm with plagues. The pandemic response, when it goes wrong, is among other things, a moral violence. In post-colonial nations, what is simply a benign incompetence of billionaires takes a far more malicious form. Indian Muslims were accused of spreading coronavirus the same way Jews were accused of spreading typhus in Nazi Germany, most prominently in Uttar Pradesh, where the right-wing chief minister, Yogi Adityanath, put up posters of protesters and activists in prominent places in Lucknow, the capital city of UP, likening these people to the virus. The posters had their names, addresses, and photographs of those people questioning the government response. This was an open invitation for extrajudicial justice, which Yogi Adityanath has already gained a reputation for. It was then an insult to injury to watch Melinda Gates in December 2022 arrive in Uttar Pradesh for a photo op with Yogi Adityanath. She called the government's handling of the pandemic, in which Indian Muslims were incarcerated, activists and journalists were jailed. She called it commendable. She also said that UP is not just a model for India, but for the world, with the assuredness of someone who will never have to live in UP. India's second is an indictment of the incompetence of the local government. Of course it is. But it also reveals the ugly and morally void underbelly of philanthropy foundations. Is this the world Melinda Gates wants to buy with her billions? One in which there is no freedom of speech and extrajudicial murder is normal. I don't intend to say that career philanthropists do not love humanity. I simply intend to lay on the table the fact that their love, however illusory or real, is subject to their convenience, much like their dollars. It is what makes organized philanthropy the gangrene that's eating into the heart of global health. In these plague years, big philanthropy has eroded the moral authority because it's incapable of taking decisions that are not in self-interest. Self-dealing and amassing wealth is central to philanthropic foundations that amassed wealth by self-dealing and tax evasion. It is not a coincidence that a billionaire sitting in Seattle has created a system that looks for a billionaire sitting in Seattle for solutions during a pandemic. Is Bill Gates not as answerable for the pandemic response as Bolsonaro or Narendra Modi? To not address this question is a betrayal of the people we have already lost. Every democratic society, especially in the post-colonial world, is already weighing the competing interests of philanthropies and the democratic values of the country. The discontent of the plague years have been of the kind from which radical ideas have sprung. Change is in the air. One in which the world is taking baby steps towards decolonizing international law for infectious diseases. There has been a historic mobilization among post-colonial nations who in October 2020, led by India and South Africa, mobilized over 100 other nations, along with 140 heads of state, a number of Nobel laureates, and the Pope, to fight patent monopolies. Since then, people around the world have protested the unjust intellectual property system that concentrates power in the hands of few. The flames have been lit, and fortunately for us, like plagues, radical ideas are infectious too. This fight marks the beginning of a new level of public scrutiny on the rights to intellectual property that has been long overdue. In 2021, 194 member states of the WHO began negotiating the pandemic treaty, the zero draft of which was released last month. The treaty is not simply an attempt to address a blind spot in international law. It is negotiating ethical questions of medicine and morality as well. Each plague has had its chronicler, and in the past 3 years, writers like me have chronicled debilitating grief as well as dizzying triumphs of science. Before the discontents of the plague years gave birth to policy negotiation, it gave birth to great writing about love and grief. People of science need to talk more about unscientific things because science can only succeed if it learns to work in a flawed and broken world, far away from the lab setting. What we are seeing now is a splintering of global health order to a breaking point, which is the only joy I find in this endless misery, that this ossified structure is coming to an end. COVAX is a great example of how Gates Foundation has privatized policy making itself. Every time the question of rights is raised, it is answered with charity, the opium of the rich, which has been consecrated as an ideology within structures of global health. People of the global south are not demanding their right to health anymore. It is not anyone else's to give. They are organizing. The plague years have been unprecedented investment in R&D in African nations, especially in mRNA vaccines. These are fragile gains against a marauding force we must take a moment to celebrate. Other important lessons have been learned too. India knows it cannot manufacture for the whole world as well as inoculate its own people. African nations know they cannot depend on India either. This new reality is the dawn of a sobering truth that a global response cannot be built around donations and charity and largesse of billionaires. Their definition of progress comes from a bean counter's imagination. Not a single life can be saved without someone, preferably a billionaire, getting richer out of it. We need to think about the disingenuous mathematics involved in philanthropy. It's always been cruel, no matter how well-intentioned. It's toxic kindness masqueraded as love for humanity. And that is what global health order lacks the most, love. Our hope for nirvana, salvation, as well as salve, cannot be pinned on philanthropy. It is incapable of looking at the global south and not seeing a field where data is to be tested and not seeing a giant laboratory for best experiments money can buy. It cannot help but see a place where people are clinical trial subjects but expendable as human beings. But they are not. They are people with families and stories and aspirations. The past 3 years have been a time of pervasive grief. It's been the kind of grief that is neither easy to witness nor easy to alleviate. This grief was caused in no small measure by philanthropists who still want pedestals and praise for a job they consider to be well done. As of this month, 10 countries still remain below 10% vaccination rate. Nobel laureates and world leaders like Joseph Stiglitz and Ban Ki-moon recently released a scathing analysis of the world's pandemic response by calling the vaccine equity a scar on the world's conscience. They called on the world leaders to pledge that never again will the lives of people in wealthy countries be prioritized over the lives of people in the global south. Never again will publicly funded science be locked in private monopolies. And never again will a company's desire to make extraordinary profits come before the needs of humanity. Is it not fair, or at least theoretically possible, that the political climate demand that we set aside old structures and build new ones? At this historic juncture, bargaining for our right to health with big philanthropy or big pharma is equal to building a future on quicksand. As we mark the 3rd anniversary of a devastating pandemic and go through the annual ritual of World Tuberculosis Day, I want to invoke the writer Arundhati Roy, the oracle of our times, who poetically said that we don't need anniversaries to remember things we cannot forget. In these 3 years, organized philanthropy, by failing to mass-produce vaccines, has mass-produced grave diggers. The structural cracks in global health order, as well as organized philanthropy, lay bare naked in front of us. We have the tools to fix these structures and plan an equitable response. We have the tools to build a world without saviors. All that's left for us is to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vidya. That was just a fascinating talk, and I have to say for myself, I was on the edge of my seat. So I'm sorry that you can't hear the round of applause if we were all there with you in person, because I'm sure you would be getting one. So please let me pass that on behalf of our group today. Really some important and really thought-provoking aspects and issues that you brought up that many of us have, I think, are aware of, but not to the depth of which that you shared with us. So thank you very much. So if there are any questions from the group, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you're welcome to raise your hand and speak to Vidya directly. So Ed, I see there's a number of questions coming through. Okay, so I see Ed, you've put a question in there. Would you like to ask her directly?
Hi, very stimulating talk. On a personal note, I support a number of small philanthropy organizations. I don't do it to be a savior. I hope that your comments are primarily directed towards big organized multi-billion-dollar philanthropy organizations and not the small ones that are trying to do some good and show their love. My question was, if only 4% of Indians have been immunized against COVID, and yet it's a major vaccine manufacturer, was this COVAX's problem, or public health management in India. Why is it so low?
No, it's not 4% now. I meant that at the time, the second wave, we had a devastating second wave. And at that time, when the second wave peaked, we had only 4% vaccinated. And this is still a good question. Why had only 4% been vaccinated? And a large part of it is the regional government. I don't know how much you're familiar with Indian politics, but we have a right-wing government, which was not very different from what Donald Trump was doing at that time. You know, their version was injecting disinfectant in veins. Or something like that Trump said. But in my country, the political party was championing cow urine or yoga, and as prophylaxis against COVID. And there was science denialism. There was it was not simply health; it was politics. And when with vaccinations, Serum Institute initially before the second wave was only supposed to exclusively supply to Geneva. So we had Bharat Biotech, which is a second Indian company, which had a vaccine at that point. But the Serum Institute is the world's largest generic drug maker, which is why they have this long-standing relationship with the Gates Foundation. And Bharat Biotech is not at that scale. But even with Bharat Biotech, I don't know, I'm sure you remember in the US where states were bidding initially for PPE and vaccines. That was exactly the kind of thing happening in every part of the world, including here as well. And the larger point here is that none of this would have happened had these vaccines not been under patent monopolies. And it's not a bleeding heart leftist demand to have. It actually was funded by taxpayers, and it came out of universities. And then we just handed them over in a very bad deal, and a lot of people died because of that. So it's not a simple answer. It's a mishmash of politics and medicine.
Thank you.
So maybe I'll take this opportunity to ask a question of my own. And Vidya, I'm wondering, I really liked your quote about how we're operating from this hippie paradise inside a John Lennon song. But I'm wondering, for those of us who do want to and who are involved in global health activities, how would you see us moving forward? And do you see a future for organizations or groups like COVAX, or do you think that we really need to move to a decentralized approach where the nations themselves are leading those calls?
I thank you for that question. The thing is, and we saw this in the initial first few months of when coronavirus was declared a public health emergency, and then each country was deciding whether we open our airspace or close our airspace, and supply chains broke down. So the first thing is, in what I now know, not as a science person, but just someone who studied sociology and is a writer, is that nobody can help anyone else when something of this scale is going down. The biggest help we can do is make sure that communities immediately around us are doing well. About COVAX, I see COVAX is a very unique case, because in this case, Big Pharma as well as big philanthropy, their interests were just so neatly aligned. I don't see COVAX as a solution at all. We wouldn't do this if our house was on fire. We wouldn't be like only one tap will be used to, every hand is on deck in a crisis. And I don't see why every nation should not be able to supply its own needs, especially with taxpayer-funded vaccines, especially when countries were bidding. Countries in Asia and Africa wanted to buy fair and square, but richer nations jumped the queue, and there was a bidding for vaccines, so they overpaid. And of course, someone who's paying in rupees cannot fight someone who's paying in dollars. There's this whole, you cannot talk about just this without talking about the economic system we've set up. And it's a system that has set out to reliably fail Black and brown nations. And none of this is a coincidence. So I don't see how COAX can work. But then I'm very optimistic because there is now an mRNA hub in South Africa. It's working slowly and there are transparency issues. But this is not just me saying whatever's bubbling in my head. People in the Global South realize all of everything that I've said. Whether the Gates Foundation realizes it or not is a different question.
Thank you so much, Vidya. Ian, would you like to ask your question? Please go ahead.
Sure, that was fantastic. It was really thought-provoking. So you just mentioned kind of systems and broader systems that kind of contribute towards inequities and inequalities. And I, in an ideal world, would love to see those changed and barriers brought down. But I don't see that happening in the short term. And so what I struggle with is whether or not I should be contributing to charities, because I worry that I'm contributing to the perpetuation of a system that is, continuing to lead to inequities and inequalities. And I'd just be curious your thoughts on that.
I struggle with that question just the same because I live in a very unequal country. I am Hindu in a country where Muslim journalists are in jail. So many of my colleagues are in jail. And this is what I believe about charity. And this is what I believe about any sort of large scale. With charity, I don't see, the thing is when you put these kind of ideas out there, I feel like it's a conversation for us to, I really wish we were all in a room together so we could go back and forth on this, because I alone cannot come with a solution, and I alone don't have that brain or the expertise to solve this giant problem. I can do my bit, and with charity, what I do is I research a lot and I tend to go hyper local. And it gives me the sustenance to keep giving as much as I can. I don't believe in large-scale philanthropies. I don't believe in countries that take money in one part of the globe, saying that they're going to help people in a completely different part, where they have no skin in the game. And so we see things like Melinda Gates coming and doing a photo op with a completely radical right leader who she will not stand in the same photo if it was an American politician. She wouldn't do this for optics in her part of the world. So I think that kind of charity is just toxic. If that's...
I agree, and that's really helpful. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and I think that goes to what you were speaking to, Vidya, and I think you phrased this really nicely in terms of these structures like the Gates Foundation are simply incapable of acting in ways that are not in their own interest. And I think it's important that we recognize that, at least moving forward, that these groups in power are, despite what they may say and what they are trying to do, they will also retain that power. And I think you've highlighted that really, really nicely and illustrated that with a number of examples. And you also had a comment. Would you like to share your comment?
Sure. So after the second wave, we are hearing from our colleagues in various countries, particularly for me, South Africa and Cameroon, where the supply was there. The community health workers are trying to get people vaccinated, and there was a great deal of hesitancy, refusals, etc., and everything became kind of outdated, expired. And so at that point, what is your thought around the role and the impact of the, let's say, COVAX, and some of the large NGOs, and the impact of the smaller NGOs who are trying to actually get the people vaccinated, and why is there such an inequity in the numbers that were finally getting vaccinated?
I'm not very familiar with the specific countries that you spoke of, but there was vaccine hesitancy in my country as well.
Yeah,
there was vaccine hesitancy
yes.
there were anti-vaxxers in the US as well. Frankly, the truth is, every time there has been plagues, there has been science denialism. I study sociology. My training is in sociology. And what has happened with this plague is that the world is at this point where the pendulum is swinging towards right wing. It takes a few decades for it to swing back, and we've seen it through history. And I won't go into that. My point for bringing up the political context is that I will be very, very linking vaccine hesitancy in developing nations directly to the expiry, because COVAX by itself was not sending, the supply chains had completely broken because of what flights could go in, and there were all sorts of issues. So it wasn't so neat that the people there don't want it, so the vaccines are expiring. But I'm sure there was some of that as well. Again, like I say, a crisis this big is a collaborative effort. Everyone has enough blame to share. And about the NGOs left on the field, my heart goes out to them. In India, I remember I had activists who started helping people, trying to get them oxygen cylinders initially. It started with them helping people trying to get beds. Then they tried to get them oxygen cylinders. And within a span of like 24 to 36 hours, I was speaking and interviewing people who were telling me we've gone from helping patients find a bed in a hospital to just moving the dead away from the dying, because the dead were just piling. So people who are local NGOs who are left to not only witness the tragedy, but also, bear the brunt of the anger, my heart goes out to them. I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I was just trying to get the relationship between the issue around the charity issue and the big charities, and whether some of that could have been better coordinated. I mean, there's so many issues that are going on. You can't say it's because of this or because of that. But it was very shocking to me when I kept hearing about all these. Finally, it's there, and then we've got this whole blowback. Just like in your book, you talk about the history of plagues and fear, and the way there's anti-science at any time. So it's fascinating to read.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. We have a question from Innocent, and then we have one last question from Deborah in the chat, and we'll wrap up. Innocent, would you like to go ahead?
Thanks, Vidya, for a very stimulating discussion. I've been working with the WHO for the last 20 years. In the last 6 years, I was representing the WHO to the African Union. And the discussions we are having reminds me of the discussions on decolonization of global health. And believe it or not, it's only when I came to Canada 2 years ago that I started attending meetings discussing about decolonizing global health. Being in the circles of the African Union, there had never been a discussion on that topic. So that means that, maybe what I want to say is, I think the ball is in the camp of the global South. It is up to us. I'm from Rwanda, by the way. I'm from Rwanda, one of the countries which is trying to put up an mRNA vaccine facility, and I've seen that the equipment actually for that facility is starting coming in last week. So the ball is in our camp. It's up to us to really determine what we want and work towards that. When I was attending meetings within the African Union, I saw that there is a great effort being put into improving governance, improving democratic practices, increasing domestic health financing actually in countries, and also developing local manufacturing of medicines and vaccines. So it may take some time, but we are definitely going to get there sooner or later.
Inshallah.
Thanks, Innocent. That was great to end on a positive note. So thank you, Vidya. It's been just an absolute pleasure to have you talk today. I think this was incredibly thought-provoking and really, really important for us here, as many of us, as Innocent, alluded to, are navigating global health in a post-pandemic world and trying to understand our role as decolonization moves forward and the global South structures and those power dynamics change, or we hope they change moving forward. So thank you so much. This was really excellent, and I hope we will have you back again as in the future as your work progresses. So thank you very much. If I can just make a small plea to the group, there is a you'll see a small survey which will come up at the end. So please, if you wouldn't mind answering those questions, it'll just take a moment of your time, and it's really helpful for us in our planning purposes to keep these seminars meeting the needs of our group. So thank you so much, and thank you, Vidya. I know it's quite late there now, so thank you for staying up late. This was really wonderful.
Thank you for
Many thanks
having
for your
me.
time and thoughts.